Has the webinar started? Am I hearing anything?
Hi. Hey, mommy. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Has the meeting started?
Good
I'm
morning.
not hearing anyone.
Yes,
It started now?
we're just starting.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we're just
Okay,
starting.
okay.
It's starting now. Can you all hear me? Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Mami Okuya Amwachum, and I am the communications coordinator for Anglophone West and North Africa for Afrobarometer. I'm based at CDD Ghana, and I'll be moderating this conversation with us all. So thank you so much for joining us. We start now. And as a brief introduction, first off, I'd like to welcome you all to today's D4GA webinar, which is in partnership with the African Governance Architecture Secretariat. We usually call them AGA. It's also in partnership with the African Union Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, ECOSOC, and the African Union Office of the Youth Envoy. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss the state of education in Africa and the role expected of CSOs towards achieving improved standards and quality of education as aspired by Africans and as stated in the AU Agenda 2063, the CSA 2016 to 2025, and also the UN SDG Goal 4. Please note that this webinar is the first of a series of others that will be jointly organized by the D4GA in partnership with the AU organs I mentioned earlier, but particularly in support of the AU theme for 2024. And I quote, educate an African fit for the 21st century, building resilient education systems for increased access to inclusive, lifelong, quality, and relevant learning in Africa. I mean, I really, really love this quote, this theme. I think is really packed with so many things that we can discuss, and essentially that's why we're here today to contribute to this theme set by the AU. So I'd also like to introduce our speakers for today. We have quite a number. We have Ambassador Salah Hamad. He is the head of the ALGA Secretariat based in the AU. We also have Brenda Moore. She's the Deputy Presiding Officer for ECOSOC, also based at the AU. We have Justice Mevizenge. He is a senior researcher based at Laws Africa. We have Gumiso Chise. She's with the Office of the Youth Envoy, also based at the AU. We have Divine Pe. Divine is the senior programs officer based in Gambia. And then we have Otemo Namwawa. He's the director with Human Rights Africa. So as you can see, we have an amazing panel speakers who will be engaging us in this conversation. And just before we go into it, I'd just like to share some house rules with all of us. And the first being that this session is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. So I ask you to kindly check the chat box. We will have the link there, and we entreat you to please share it widely with all your friends and family and among your network. Amazing speakers who will be engaging us in this box. We have the link there. We also have the Q&A feature box, so you can type in your questions. I'll be reading some of them out during the Q&A session. So we also would encourage you to engage with us online on social media, and the hashtag to use for this conversation is hashtag African Voices for African Policy, hashtag Year of Education, hashtag Agenda 2063. We'll be putting all that in the chat box. And please tag us on X, formerly Twitter, is at data, the figure 4, Gov Africa, at African LII, at CDDGHA, at IJR, at IDS, and at Afrobarometer. Like I said earlier, we'll put all this in the chat box. So going right into it, I'd like to call on Douglas Wanja to give us the opening remarks and also to tell us a bit about Data for Governance Alliance, which is D4GA. Douglas, a bit of introduction before he comes in. Douglas is an economist, lecturer, researcher, and data analyst based at the Institute for Development Studies, University of Nairobi, where he teaches quantitative economics and research. Now, Douglas has over 15 years of experience in conducting economic and social research, and he has worked with notable organizations such as WHO, USAID, UN, and a whole lot. So, Douglas, if you're ready, we are ready to hear from you. Please, you have the floor.
So thank you so much, Mame, for that humbling introduction. First of all, to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Ambassador Salah Mohammed, the head of AGA Secretariat at the African Union, who is present with us today and to grace this occasion. And also to just in a humble way to welcome our participants to this very kind and very good webinar that we're going to have today. And on behalf of Data for Governance Alliance, I say welcome. So perhaps I can start by just saying that Data for Governance Alliance is a consortium of 5 members. We have Afrobarometer that are based in Ghana. We have also Center for Democracy and Development, also based in Ghana. We have Institute for Justice and Reconciliation that is based in South Africa. IDS, where I sit at the University of Nairobi. And we came together and through the funding from the European Union, tried to find ways in which we can ensure that the civil society organizations become the amplifiers of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union on issues especially to do with democracy, issues to do with human rights and governance. And what we have done in the last 2 or 3 years that we have been in existence is to try and build capacity for our civil society organizations, not only to become better advocates for all their issues and spaces that they deal with, but also to become effective, to become efficient in the use of data to be able to do advocacy. And we have been trying to build capacity for them. And I think we have been very successful in that. So we have had several convenings and several also engagements with them. And we are so happy that as even we look forward to work more with the African Union through the organs and institutions, is that we are also having such a webinar today to be able to amplify the theme of the African Union this year, which will be on education, as we try to see how we can actually be able to also participate in what African Union want to do, especially in regards to coming up and educating an African who is ready for and fit for the 21st century. So in a humbling way, that is what we call Data for Governance Alliance. And we have been doing a lot of activities. And we are so happy with the civil society organizations, not only in East African region, but also in West Africa, where we have some members present today. We have also our CSOs represented from South Africa, where we have also our coordinator there, who is Nyasha, and I think he's also present here today. So we are so delighted that now today we have managed to come together in one house, and where we can be able to share our ideas and what we think that education can do for us in the next 1 year, as we also assist the African Union to actually do this work. So we are so delighted and so happy to have you today. So in a very, very special way, I welcome you all. Back to you, Mame.
Thank you, Douglas, for that introduction and explaining to us what GA is all about. That was well received. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go straight into it and receive remarks and insights from our AU organs who are with us today. And starting off, we'll hear from Brenda Moore. She is the Deputy Presiding Officer of ECOSOC, based at the AU. Now, a bit about Brenda. Brenda is the first female and Liberian Deputy Presiding Officer at ECOSOC since its establishment in 2004. And in addition to her pivotal role, she serves as the Executive Director of the Brenda. We're very happy to have you here. We're also ready to hear from you. You have the
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so very much. I'm happy to be here. I want to say thank you for hosting these conversations. They are very important right now. It's always important when you're discussing things around education, because I personally believe that education is one of the most powerful tools to lift all of us out of poverty. For those who may not know, just a little background, ECOSOC. ECOSOC is the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council for the African Union, basically the civil society arm of the African Union. And our mission is to engage African citizenry, providing a platform for engagement on social cultural issues, and to be able to elevate conversations that are happening in our different countries and communities with the wider African audience. Some of our roles and things that we're supposed to do on mandates includes contributing to advisory opinions that we provide to the AU, different things that are happening in our different countries, and evidence-based research reports to the different organs. Excuse me, what's the lady's name? Is this where I do the presentation on the comments on civil society role, or just for about ECOSOC?
Yes, Brenda.
Okay, great. So I'm so happy that when I saw the theme of this year at the beginning of the year, I was really excited, because too many times I feel like we don't have clear conversations on education, and for Africa, it's continued to be considered as the new horizon, the new frontier, but yet you have a lot of our citizens still living with that are not educated. And one of the challenges a couple of challenges that I've seen has been number one, the political will. There has not been an intentional long-term effort by governments that incorporates all forms of education. Now, not just the formal education in classrooms that we're all known about, but also informal education as well, with particular attention to public schools. Political will in regards to budgeting, which is so critical, because you'll find out that most African countries have not met the 20% budgetary allocation as considered as a standard. So because of that, you'll find that the financing, the political will, the ability for countries to be able to really educate this population has not been as fruitful as it should be. Most countries in West Africa are falling short of meeting the regional targets, and there's a disconnect between education financing and education performance, and this raises serious concerns about value for money in education spending. We've also seen poor education performance is as much related to low investment in the sector as it is to inefficient use of existing resources. Now, there's also lack of clear communication between the value of education and wealth or poverty alleviation, thus making many citizens opting for short-term gains, such as farming, artisanal mining, petty trade, etc. We also cannot ignore that there has been inadequate infrastructure, which also hinders access to education and quality education provision. Now, how can CSO continue to engage governments to, what's the role? I think a role of civil society in my experience has been really advocating, being the voice for citizens on conversations, because not many citizens follow national conversations on education. So civil society actors are well positioned, I should say, to be able to elevate some of the conversations that are taking place in the grassroots levels. And that also includes pushing for increased budgetary allocation. Um, Most countries have not, I've mentioned that before, most countries have not met the minimum or their standard for 20%. And so CSOs should continue, like in Liberia right now, there are different consortiums that are raising the conversation, keeping the conversation going on the front burner regarding increasing budgetary allocation for education. And this also includes civil society actors engaging with lawmakers, members of parliament, to also see reason. I don't know why we have to do that, because they should see reason, they're educated, but we have to continue the conversation. The other thing I think civil society can do is also develop long-term, or push governments to develop long-term education sector plans that are comprehensive and transcends government tenures and isn't particularly hinged on specific political ideologies. Because oftentimes what we see is that government tenure is maybe 6 years, 4 years, they come up with one plan, and then when that government leaves, then a new plan is developed. And this constantly means that the education sectors in different countries are being constantly reset, which isn't what you will see in Western countries, if I should say that. So we need to see where civil society actors can start to push governments to have one comprehensive plan that transcends, that's long-term, it transcends several governments, and then budgetary allocation can then support that plan. The last thing I think, besides of elevating some of the different conversations at the grassroots levels, in addition to that, I think civil society organizations are also well positioned to raise awareness of governments, to hold more citizen forums that discusses education, its importance, government spending, and accountability. Now, too often we ask for increment, but then there's the other part of it is the accountability portion, and I have not seen many governments being as accountable to the citizens as they should be with regards to education spending. So I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. And if it's one thing you said that struck me is that we need to have these long-term educational policies that transcends political, ideologies and, not hinge on a political turnover. And I think that is really, really critical for us. Thank you so much. So we'll then move on to hear from Gumiso Chisi. She's with the Office of the Youth Envoy. Gumi, you have 10 minutes to share your remarks with us. So please, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Mame, and good morning, good day, everyone. I am honored to be part of this conversation to discuss a critical topic as education, one component that is key to the development of our continent. So allow me to continue on existing or set protocol already, acknowledging everybody else, including Ambassador Salah Hamad. Good to have you over here. So I'm going to delve deeper into three key things. Number one, the role of the youth envoy, the work that she's done. Number two, education in general. And number three, the pathways for civil society engagement. Now, I represent the Office of the African Union, the Chairperson's Youth Envoy, Ms. Chidom Pember. And her role is that of a political nature. It's basically a political office that's mandated to advocate for the implementation of progressive policies, or rather impactful actions that will promote the engagement of young people, their participation and leadership as well across the continent. So she represents and advocates for their voices and making sure that the relevant African Union decision-making bodies, they take into account these views of the young people for political commitments purposes. And so since her appointment in 2021, end of 2021, there have been many activities in the office on various topics, be it governance, be it economic inclusion, be it gender, or related to development and young people. And so since we are discussing education today, I'll focus on education. Sometime in 2021 to 2022, the office, or rather the envoy, was part of a task force on education, which was put together by the Commissioner of Education to start advocating and lobbying for the theme of the African Union to be on education. So now 2024, it's been realized, and this process started sometime in about 2021, 2022. And further along, the Youth Envoy engaged in various consultations, which she called listening tours from 2022. This involved going to various countries, meeting with young people, those in difficult situations, including refugees as well, going to youth hubs, to tech hubs, to understand what young people wanted really on the ground. And so she visited many countries throughout 2022, and it's still ongoing now. And as a result of those conversations, the office, together with consultations with other young people, came up with a youth manifesto on education called This is Our Future. Now, this manifesto was then presented to ministers of education in Africa for their adoption, and also presented to the African presidents as well for their adoption at a high-level side event on transforming education in Africa, which was conducted on the sidelines of the Transforming Education Summit in New York. Now, this manifesto is on education, and it focused on a few things. It highlighted the challenges of education in Africa, what young people were going to do themselves to address education issues, which included things like awareness raising, engaging with various stakeholders, also making sure that whatever space they had in education, they were putting forth their interests and their voices. And lastly, as part of that manifesto are recommendations, 6 of them. The first one, these recommendations were given to governments, to development partners, to foundations, to civil society as well. Part of these recommendations, I'll mention 6 of them, focused on innovation. This is innovation in teaching generally, in learning as well, and digital opportunities. The second one was on increasing the number of teachers and making sure that they are capacitated, they also have the right tools. Number 3 was on making schools safe, the environment safe, both the virtual environment and the physical classroom, also safe for learning for girls. Number 4 was on increasing education funding and improving the quality of spending. Number 5, prioritizing science and tech, and also vocational education, looking at how the trends are going in terms of market needs. And number 6 was on establishing and ensuring that we have strengthened the multi-stakeholder partnerships for education. And we see some of the results of this manifesto. In fact, recently, the president of Sierra Leone passed a decision to ensure that there's free sanitary ware in all schools, which was one of the highlights of the manifesto itself. So we see some of these things trickling down and being implemented on the ground. I think after this webinar, we're going to share some links to some of the opinion pieces that the Youth Envoy has written together with the World Bank Director for Global Education, for example, on education, and we'll also share a link to this education manifesto. Now, we must focus on a few things when we are talking about education, with regards particularly to young people. Number 1, the relevance of the education, the quality, the inclusivity of our current education system. We see that the theme of the year focuses on educating and upskilling people that are relevant for the 21st century. And on our side, as we are focusing on young people as well, we look at this and say, have we educated and upskilled young people that are fit for this 21st century and going forward? And so over time, there's been a tendency to focus on the traditional educational format, which is the formal education, like Brenda was saying, which is totally fine as well. But we must cast the net a bit wider to even consider other forms of education as we are moving forward. Things like technical vocational education, and how to strengthen this side of education, because it really contributes particularly to wealth today and even the digital world moving forward. And so when we focus on vocational training or technical training, technical skilling, we must look also at AI in Africa, digital skills and other areas that are going to be relevant for what? There are about 1 billion young people that are going to be inhabiting Africa in 2050. And we know that by 2030, for example, roughly 230 million jobs in Africa are going to demand digital skills. So our education should also focus in that direction, beyond the formal, focus also on digital skills. This is why the Office of the Youth Envoy, sometime in 2022 to 2023, we launched what we called the Digital Skills Campaign, and now it's called MAD, M-A-D, which is Make Africa Digital. This is an ongoing initiative which has been launched in about 7 countries so far, and targeting 10 more countries for advocacy and further trainings in 2024. And this partnership is, and this initiative is in partnership with Google, where Google comes to a different country, trains the young people, and after that, the training is ongoing to ensure that they have the digital skills. So focusing on education beyond the traditional format remains critical. I will also mention maybe 3 critical areas for advancement, which civil society can also take part in or find a pathway for entry. Number 1 is access. We have a lot of young people that are displaced in Africa. We also have refugees. We have people that are going through conflicts and wars. There's a digital divide. There are opportunities for women and girls, those that are on the margins, including the disabled people. We focus a lot on leaving no one behind, but these are some of the groups that we should look at when we're talking about education, particularly for young people, and ensuring that we leave no one behind. Number 2 is investments. Like Brenda was saying, how much money is dedicated to education, and can we increase it? Beyond increasing it, do we also take accountability of the commitments that have been given by governments, by leaders, by foundations? Can we increase this budget, or increase the money that we have for education from private sector, from even civil society? And we know that most African countries are failing to meet the minimum spending benchmarks for education. Global Partnerships for Education also reports the same thing. And so what can we do in terms of investments? We see a pathway for entry here. Some other areas that we must look at for investment include research and innovation. There's one project in Nigeria called Investment in Digital and Creative Enterprises, IDICE. This is an initiative of the federal government of Nigeria with partnerships and funding from some development partners such as the FDB, the French Development Agency, the Islamic Bank, and many more on the ground. And so this program is not only looking to invest, but also investing in different aspects of education, research, innovation, ensuring that there's digital entrepreneurship, for example, there's a creative component inculcated in education in universities, creating university centers of excellence on innovation in education, creating the same thing in polytechnics, creating a fund for young people, leaving school young people in entrepreneurship. So there are pathways to come up with programs that inculcate different components to education, different areas, different partners, different methods of funding. For example, social impact bonds, can we look at that even in civil society or private sector? And just to conclude, the last point on the 3, so access, investments, and the last one is policies. Do we have national action plans for some of the educational policies that have been developed? We are talking about operationalizing the education manifesto like I've given, but we also have the 10-year continental education strategy, the CSA. Do we have national practical solutions or tasks or tactics to operationalize these? And so we need to look at policies. So in conclusion, I must say, the relevant education for the young people that are fit for the 21st century, it cannot exclude the voices of the youth who make up majority today and the future. It cannot ignore the calls for security, the plight of those that are in conflict situations, the needs of young women and girls, the calls to close the digital divide, and even the loud requests for increased financial resources. When African civil society, governments, private sector, development partners, and foundations collaborate innovatively, we'll see that education in Africa will become so explosive and undeniable that the rest of the globe will be looking to us for solutions. So thank you so much. This is all from my side.
Thank you so much. That's so a lot to unpack. Gumi, so thank you for speaking to us. And one of the things I took away is how it's important for us to look at other forms of education. We're talking about technical, we're talking about vocational, we're talking about introducing digital skills, and then the acronym MAD, Make Africa Digital. I mean, if I will walk away with nothing at all, I'll walk away with that. Make Africa Digital. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we are honored to hear from Ambassador Salah Hamad. He is the acting head of the African Governance Architecture and the African Peace and Security Architecture, so the APSA Secretariat, and also the senior human rights expert within the Governance and Conflict Prevention Directorate of the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security of the African Union Commission. So, Ambassador, if you're ready, we're also ready to hear from you. Please, you have the floor.
Mami, I must begin by thanking you for your very wise moderation. And also through you, I really wish to thank the organizers, my dear friend and brother, Douglas Wanja from Data for Governance Alliance, and all the colleagues behind the scene. And I wish to also acknowledge the presence of my dear sister Brenda Moore, the deputy presiding officer of ECOSOC, as well as the representative of the Office of the Youth Envoy, and all those who are available today despite their very busy schedule. You would agree with me that this topic today is extremely important as we proceed with the implementation of Agenda 2063 to build the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. Education has been declared as the theme of this year by our heads of state and government, simply because they have realized in their own wisdom the need to take steps to reform education as a whole in Africa and to focus on an education system that is relevant to our needs as Africans and also to the needs of our children in Africa. Despite the progress made in many African countries, you would agree with me that the current state of affairs is not really very pleasant. Um, Children in Africa, they count to almost half of the population, if we are talking about 1.2 billion citizens. And they are, in fact, supposed to reach about a billion by 2055. So we are really talking about the vast majority of our African population. And in some practical terms, we are also talking about a vast human resource capacity that could help to lift hundreds of millions of Africans out of poverty by then. That is, of course, if it is in the right on the right track, it will then allow us to achieve the ultimate goal of building the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve by 2063. But the problem is the current educational system, and I'm not really an expert in the field, but hopefully you would agree with me that the current educational system uh, or systems in Africa, they are inherited from our colonial power. And at that time, the collective or the entire system that was built, whether by Francophone or Anglo, or within the Anglophone regions, or the Francophone or North Africa region, or other regions of Africa. It was meant for it to produce those who could help sustain the colonial authority and power at the national level by providing the necessary uh, skills that are needed at that time. 60 years later, we have naturally done an evaluation that will examine the current state of affairs to determine whether there is really need to reform the system, so then we can develop an African educational system that matches the context of the African situation and the African needs, and also assist our African societies, our African people, our African government, our African nations, our African member states to proceed with building the building resilience, in fact, and also building uh, uh, societies that are quite developed and quite improved. We are facing with a huge number of kids that are out of school today. There are some reports from Afrobarometer and other civil society organizations talking about close to 48% of children in Africa leave primary school without basic education. This is a huge number. This is a very big loss for Africa and for the African people. Regrettably, many of them drop out because of so many issues, but particularly girls, because of financial issues, but also because of early pregnancy. In addition to that, we see in many African countries, and also these are based on the reports that produced by Afrobarometer and other organizations, that many schools are not equipped. They are not, in fact, equipped with necessary number of teachers. So the ratio teacher to students is extremely high. One teacher is probably servicing a class of 60 to 100 students. In addition to that, also our students are not receiving the necessary social services that are supposed to be supporting their journey while they are receiving education. Many of them, they are not receiving also the support, free meals and others that will really help them to sustain themselves during the journey of receiving education. I think I've been muted. In addition to that, I think if we look at the expenditure of our governments and member states in general, we see education is not really up to the standards. Education is not receiving the funding that it deserves. Of course, the focus is on military and security and other areas of expenditure or sectors of expenditure, but not education. Today, education really should be reevaluated to at least enable the development of a person that will be fit within what we really need in Africa. What I mean by that, it is not really the quality or the quantity, but it's in fact about what the skills that are needed today. And I think my sister from the Office of the Youth Envoy spoke clearly about issues related to innovation, technology, and all of these fields that we really lack in Africa and we really need to focus on. By the way, if you visit, and I'm sure many of us have experienced this, if you visit European countries, especially in the West European side or North America, and you open the medical directory, you will find many doctors that have been trained in African universities, African graduates that left the continent seeking better employment, better life, and they indeed constitute a very large number of, of doctors and medical in the medical service. But many politicians today in Africa, they don't really send, and of course rich people also, they don't send their kids to school in Africa. The same schools that produce so many doctors and that are well known now in Europe, in America, Canada, and elsewhere, we don't really follow the same path because we don't believe the system anymore. We don't trust the system anymore. And now politicians and rich people are sending their kids to study in Europe instead of studying here within the continent. So there's lack of trust in our academic institutions. And this is also an issue that we really need to address. The African Union, through the various instruments and mechanisms that we have in place, and in this year, in particular 2024, will be assisting member states to look into what could emerge as an action plan that could assist our member states to reform education at the national level. We are also assisting our member states to include elements that have been missing from our school curricula: civic education, education related to the Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, on how our kids could be good citizens in the future once they reach the age that they are supposed to support and produce and contribute to building the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. So the plan is big, and because the plan is really big, we can't really do it on our own as African Union. And that is why we are counting heavily on the support that we can get from civil society as well. And I'm glad that our dear sister Brenda Moore is here with us today representing ECOSOC, which is the civil society parliament when it comes to the participation of civil society in the affairs of the African Union. Civil society represent the voices of African citizens, and they really can play a very big role in this reform process, so we can try to improve not only access to education in terms of numbers, but it's also in terms of quality and of quality as well. My dear brothers and sisters, reforming education in Africa, building resilience within our school system is our only way to build the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. And without that, we will not really be progressing, but indeed we will be, in fact, going back in history, and that will not really benefit, our people in Africa who are really in need of better systems of education that could be more inclusive to support them so they can gain the skills that they need to succeed in life, but also to build stronger and resilient societies and communities at the national level. We really thank you for initiating this series of webinars, and we really hope that you will include more youth and women in this process so we can try to expand the conversation, so we can also include those who are the leaders of today and the leaders of tomorrow, and equip them with the necessary information and data that they need. So then once they assume the leadership responsibility in the future, there will be true leaders, good leaders, that are paying close attention to the well-being and the welfare of our African citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sada. It's been great listening to your perspective on this issue. I mean, the figures you showed about how many children make up the African population, and also looking at how many children around the numbers that are out of school by the primary, level is very disturbing. And then Ambassador calls on us to look at reforming education at the national level. So we need to pay attention to civic education, which is very important, and then the democratic and governance, teaching our kids at this age to be good citizens, so that by the time they are older, they have better understanding of how to govern in a country. And I think that's really, really important. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will move to a different section where we're going to be looking at the independent assessments and research findings and data on education in Africa. So we're about to speak numbers, right? So to kick off this session, I'm very honored to introduce my colleague Asafika Mpako from Afrobarometer. She would share the Afrobarometer findings with us. So Asafika, if you're ready, please take over.
Thank you so much, Mame. Allow me to greet first Ambassador Salah, Ms. Brenda Moore from ECOSOC, Ms. Gumiso Chisi from the AU Youth Envoy Office, and my colleague Douglas Wanja. And to you, our valued participants, thank you so much for giving us your time today. I'm going to ask the technical team to please project my slides, if you could. Thank you so much. So as has been said, I will be presenting Afrobarometer's findings from the latest round 9 survey. And just for context, for those of you in the audience who may be unfamiliar with Afrobarometer, Afrobarometer is a Pan-African nonpartisan survey research organization that provides reliable data on African experiences and evaluations of democracy, governance, and quality of life. We have been doing this work since the year 1999, so for 25 years now. And to date, we have conducted surveys in up to 42 countries across the continent. So we're really leading the charge to close the continent's data gap. We use nationally representative samples of between 1,200 to 2,400 adult citizens, so those aged 18 years and above, and we conduct our interviews face-to-face and in the language of the respondent's choice. And our goal is really simple, and that is to make citizen voice a key pillar of policy and decision-making on the African continent. With that said, let's get straight into the findings. So we'll start first with educational attainment. On average, across the 39 countries that we surveyed in our latest round 9 survey, we found that more than half, that is 55% of adults, have secondary or post-secondary education, while 27% have primary schooling, and 18% have no formal education. Next slide, please. Educational attainment varies by country, and while about 4 in 10 adults have post-secondary qualifications in countries like Gabon at 41%, the Seychelles at 39%, the same is true of only about 1 in 20 citizens in Niger at 4%, in Malawi at 4% again, Mozambique at 5%, Burkina Faso at 6%, Tanzania again at 6%, and Madagascar at 6%. In 10 of the 39 surveyed countries, we see that 95% of all adults have some form of formal education, and this list is led by the Seychelles at 99%, Zimbabwe at 98%, and Mauritius again at 98%. At the other end of the spectrum, we find that half or more of citizens report no formal education in Niger at 65%, in Burkina Faso at 55%, in Mali at 52%, and in Guinea at 50%. Survey findings also confirm that on average, younger Africans have more education than their elders. Again, across the 39 countries, we find that about 2/3, that is 65% of respondents aged 18 to 35 have at least some secondary education, compared to 52%, 44%, and 35% of the progressively older cohorts. 1 in 8 young adults, that is 13%, report having no formal education, and that is fewer than half as many as among those who are aged 55 years and older. Again, educational attainment varies significantly by respondents' demographic characteristics. We found that women are less likely than men to have secondary or post-secondary education. So if we look at the chart, 51% of women have secondary or post-secondary education versus 59% of men. And women are also more likely to lack formal education altogether. So 20% of women versus 16% of men. The poorest respondents are also more likely than the best off to lack formal schooling, and that figure is at 25% versus 7% of the better off, and less than 1/3 as likely to have post-secondary qualifications. So 11% of poor respondents have post-secondary qualifications versus 32% of the best off. The same pattern is true for rural versus urban residents. So rural residents are more likely to lack formal schooling, and they are also more likely not to have post-secondary education. Next slide, please. Women's 4 percentage point disadvantage on average when it comes to having at least some level of formal education includes significant variation by country. And this includes double-digit gaps in countries like Guinea. So Guinea records a 15 percentage point gender gap. Benin also records a 15 percentage point gender gap. Togo, 13 percentage point gender gap. Sierra Leone is at 12 percentage points, Mali at 12 percentage points, Liberia at 10 percentage points, and Ethiopia at 10. Lesotho is the only country surveyed where the gap favors women by 9 percentage points, while 13 countries record gaps of less than 3 percentage points. So when it comes to post-secondary education, 6 countries register double-digit gaps favoring men, and this list is led by Sierra Leone at 13 percentage points, while Tunisia and the Seychelles report more women than men with higher education, and this is 5 and 4 percentage points respectively. Let's look now at out-of-school children. On average, across the 39 countries, almost half, that is 48% of adults say that school-age children who are not in school are a somewhat frequent or very frequent problem in their community. The perception of out-of-school children as widespread in their community is a majority view in 17 of the 39 surveyed countries, and it reaches as high as 83% in Liberia, which is at the very top of the list, and 71% in Angola. Only 6 countries record fewer than 1/3 of citizens who share this view, and that is led by Mauritius at the bottom of the list at 22% and Tanzania at 26%. As we all know, next slide, please, access to education generally requires access to a school. And on average, across the 39 countries, Afrobarometer enumerators found that 83% of the enumeration areas they visited had at least one public or private school within easy walking distance. No nearby schools were found in 20% of rural zones and 12% of urban zones. In 29 of the surveyed countries, rural zones were more likely than cities to lack a nearby school. And rural zones without a nearby school were most common in countries like Mauritania, Angola, Botswana, while only 4% of visited rural zones in Togo, Madagascar, Niger, and Morocco lacked a school within easy walking distance. Let's look now at contact with a public school. 1/3, that is 34% of respondents, say they had contact with a public school during the year preceding the survey, ranging from fewer than 1 in 5 Tunisians at 17% and Basotho at 19%, to half or more of Sierra Leoneans at 55% and Kenyans at 50%. Among respondents, next slide please, who had contact with public schools, 3/4, that is 74%, say they found it easy or very easy to obtain the services they needed from teachers or other school officials. Almost all Mauritians, that is 95%, agree with this assessment, and even in the least satisfied countries like Angola and Liberia, at the bottom of the list, majorities report few difficulties. On average, 74% of respondents who had contact with public schools say they were treated with respect, somewhat or a lot, by teachers and other school officials. Majorities in all surveyed countries report respectful treatment in their interactions with public schools, and this ranges from 54% in Mauritania and in Gabon to 91% in Cape Verde and in Madagascar. Let's look now at paying bribes to obtain public school services. So even despite the previous positive assessments that I've just presented to you, a significant share of the population report having to pay a bribe, give a gift, or do a favor for teachers or other school officials to obtain the service they needed. On average, 1 in 5 respondents who had contact with public schools during the previous year say they participated in this form of corruption once or twice, a few times or often. And this experience was especially common in Liberia, which is at the very top of the list at 50%, in Congo-Brazzaville at 41%, and in Angola at 39%. While this was really the case in Cape Verde at 2%, in the Seychelles at 3%, and in Mauritius at 3%. Having to pay a bribe to obtain a public school service is twice as common among citizens experiencing moderate or high levels of lived poverty, so amongst the poorest in our societies, than among their well-off counterparts. Respondents with no formal schooling are slightly more likely also to report having to pay a bribe than those with primary education or more. Let's turn now to how satisfied Africans are with their government's performance in addressing educational needs. Next slide, please. So on average, across the 39 surveyed countries, fewer than half, that is 46% of Africans think their government is performing either fairly well or very well on education, while 52% give their leaders poor marks. Assessments are overwhelmingly favorable in some countries, and if we look at the graph at the very top, this list is led by Zambia at 82%, Tanzania also at 82%, and Sierra Leone at 75%. At the other extreme, we find that fewer than 1 in 4 citizens think their government is doing a good job in education in Sudan at 16%, in Gabon at 19%, in Lesotho at 21%, and in Tunisia at 23%. Evaluations of government performance on education are similar across genders and urban-rural locations, but approval rates are relatively low among the most educated respondents and among the poorest of respondents. And if we look on average across 29 countries where this question was asked in each of 4 previous survey rounds, we find that approval of government performance on education dropped by 12 percentage points between 2011 and 2013 and 2019 and 2021, from 60% to 48%, but it has held steady since, sitting at 49% in 2021 and 2023. And this suggests that while satisfaction with public education has declined, Africans in general do not hold their governments responsible for disruptions to their children's education caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, a majority, that is 54% of respondents, say they are fairly satisfied or very satisfied with their government's efforts to minimize such disruptions, including about 3/4 of Sierra Leoneans at 77%, Tanzanians at 76%, Zambians at 75%, and Ethiopians at 74%. Majorities in 12 countries disagree, though, and this list is led by Gabon at 77% and Lesotho at 76%. Let's turn now to the most important problems that Africans want their governments to address. So on average, again, across the 39 countries surveyed, we find that education ranks 4th among the most important problems that Africans want their government to address, tying with crime and security and trailing unemployment at the very top of the list, management of the economy and health in 2nd place, and water supply and infrastructure and roads in 3rd place. And when we consider whether education is a priority and to what extent it is a priority at the country level, we find that education outranks all other problems in countries like Liberia, where this is identified by 47% as a top priority, Gabon at 43%, and Mauritania at 42%. And in all these countries, over 4 in 10 respondents cite education as a priority problem. On the flip side, in countries like South Africa, Ethiopia, Lesotho, the Seychelles, Mauritius, and Botswana at the very bottom of the list, we see that less than 1 in 10 citizens identify education as one of their top 3 priorities for immediate government action. So again, there's huge variation across the continent. I'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Asafika, thank you so much for sharing these figures. I always say that they are so revealing. As we were going through, I was asking myself what happened in 2011, 2013, when approval ratings for government's performance was as high as 60%. But then we looked at 2019 to 2021, where there's such a huge dip, right? A 12% dip. So this gives us context to, explore other areas to ask ourselves what happened, why. And so thank you so much for that session. Now I'm honored to call on Justice Mavizenge from Laws Africa. Justice is a constitutional law scholar and researcher with Africa LII, and they are part of our they are partner of D4G, as Douglas mentioned earlier, and he will also be sharing some findings with us. So, Douglas, if you are ready, please, you have the floor. Sorry, Justice. Justice.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation? Can you see it?
Yes, Justice, we can see it.
Awesome. So good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Allow me to ride on the protocol that has been observed because I've got 10 minutes only. So a bit of background about Africanly and Laws.Africa. We are based in the law faculty of the University of Cape Town, and we bring together researchers who research and produce outputs on the law as it works in Africa. And we have an information portal, which is the Africanly website, where you can find African law. You can also find the different pieces of analysis that we do on different aspects of the law. So today I have the privilege to talk about education, and my presentation is based on a policy brief that we are going to publish very soon, and it's on barriers to education in Africa and what should the African Union focus on in 2024. I think the starting point for these conversations around education, we prefer as Africanly and Laws.Africa that we start from Article 17 of the African Charter and appreciate that education is a human right. And I think that is very important because the perception sometimes in not just in communities, but I think even across different social classes is also sometimes that education is a service that has almost evolved to become a commercial good. So it's a service that is provided for profit. Yes, I think the legal framework allows education institutions to be established to provide service at a profit, but that does not depart from the fundamental principle that education is a human right, and there's consensus on that, not just in Africa but across the globe, as you will see in the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. But today, of course, because we are talking about the African Union, I talk about Article 17 of the Charter. It is also important to understand what the right of access to education, or what the right to education mean. What does it mean? When the framers and the drafters of the African Charter included Article 17, what did they have in mind, and what does it mean in contemporary terms? So there are two very important things there to keep remembering on our minds when we are talking about education. So it means, one, that the obligation of the state is to make the right to education, to make education, or rather quality education, available. That's the first thing. It must be available. And the second thing, or the second obligation, is that it must be accessible to all. There are various perspectives on what quality education means, but essentially it means there's consensus, I think, facilitated by UNESCO and UNICEF around the definition of what quality education implies. It is education that helps learners to acquire basic literacy and numeracy, enjoy learning without fear, and feel valued and included irrespective of where they come from. Right. So that kind of education must be available and must be accessible. I think there are some progress. I think the first or second speaker noted this particular point, so there is no need for me to actually belabor around it, but there is some progress. that has been achieved, I think, in Africa, and it is important to acknowledge that that progress and that investment that has been done. But there are still teething challenges. The levels of quality of access to quality education remain very low, and I think the previous speakers highlighted one of the findings of Afrobarometer, which I think is underscored by other research surveys, which then demonstrates that those findings are actually accurate. That 50% of Africans say they are not satisfied with over 50% say they are not satisfied with the performance of their governments in terms of providing access to education. And in sub-Sahara Africa, we have the highest rate of education exclusion globally, with 60% of the youth being out of school. So those are some of the serious challenges that we see on the surface. But maybe before we talk about these challenges, we also need to understand what accessibility means. So when we are saying access to education, what do we mean? There are about 3 interlinked dimensions of accessibility. We mean that quality education must be offered without discrimination on any basis, including the grounds that I listed under international law, which includes nationality. So you can't discriminate provision of education on the basis that one comes from another country and not another, or one is a foreign national or not. You can't discriminate provision of education on the basis that one is unable to afford or not, right? Which gets me to the second dimension of accessibility, which is economic accessibility, right? That education facilities, programs, and services must be affordable to all without any discrimination. And then physical accessibility, that the infrastructure, the programs, the services must be within safe physical reach. So that's what accessibility means in terms of not just the African Charter, but even in terms of what the global consensus is in the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. But what we see in Africa, and these are the issues that we expect and hope that the African Union will be paying attention to in 2024. There's a big issue to do with affordability. The tuitions are very high, I think, for most of our people in the communities. UNESCO says more than half of the world's children who are out of school are in Africa. And this is predominantly because their parents cannot afford, or their guardians cannot afford access to education. And 9 million girls on the continent constitute part of those statistics. So that slide that you see on your screen gives you a bit of a picture on the number of children who are out of school in Africa per country, mainly because of affordability issues, right? So that already means that we are in violation of most of the states that you see on your screen are in violation of their obligations under Article 17 of the African Charter, because education is supposed to be accessible to all without discrimination, even as to their economic status in society. We have high student-teacher ratio. Ambassador Sala spoke about student ratios as high as 60, and that is correct, especially in specific countries. The average is said to be 50 students per teacher. So that's the average across the continent. But we have countries, if I had more time, I would have shown you that slide. More countries that have one teacher taking care of about 70 students. So what does that mean in terms of the right to education? It's already a violation of the obligation of the state under Article 17, because Article 17 requires states to ensure that everyone has access to not just education, but quality education. And what does quality education mean? It means that there must be a reasonable student-teacher ratio, reasonable enough to allow teachers to facilitate a healthy learning environment that provides individualized assistance, because that's the only way you can ensure quality education. Of course, the UNICEF has provided leadership in terms of trying to come up with what is the reasonable student-teacher ratio, and that's 20 learners per teacher. I mean, other experts argue that you need to put it at not more than 18 per teacher. But in Africa, we are way above that already. Quality education can only be provided if the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure and facilities are accompanied and clothed with basic sanitation and related services. And I think part of the challenge is that we have so many educational facilities that have been established by governments or through partnerships that involve governments and private sectors and other external stakeholders. But 1 in every 3 primary schools in Africa do not have toilets. And that's a lack of a basic sanitation, which then affects the ability to access quality education. I think I have on your screen there a map that demonstrates percentage of primary schools without toilets by country. Part of that data is already or needs to be queried as well, because for instance, here you have South Africa indicating that 1% of the schools are without toilets. But we also need to have a discussion about the quality of toilets. You see, so obviously that research doesn't disclose the quality of toilets. And that's why some of the information may not necessarily paint the true picture of the state of affairs when it comes to sanitation facilities in education institutions. Because I think South Africa has a big problem with pit toilets. I think there have been a number of cases where children have fallen and ended up dying in pit toilets, and that is a big problem, which then contributes to the safety challenges in schools. So there are many things that I could say, but I just chose to highlight those as the major barriers that I think we see in Africa, and I have been trying to link them to what it means in terms of the obligations of the states under Article 17 of the Charter. Now, in conclusion, so the adoption of education as a theme for 2024 by the African Union is indeed a positive step, which is in sync with the public aspirations. But the central and uppermost question is, what should the AU and its organs and development partners focus on as part of their efforts to address the challenges affecting education in Africa? I have not gone through all the challenges, but I think my colleagues also in their presentations touched on some of them. But these are the 5 key issues that we are sort of lobbying for. One is addressing the problem of violence, including sexual abuse of students in schools. The policy brief that I spoke about will have a lot of analysis on the permutations of the problem of violence in schools, providing emergency relief support to parents and guardians who cannot afford to send their children to school, investing in the procurement and provision of textbooks, including by establishing digital libraries. I know I'm out of time, but I need to caution that maybe before we talk about very high level inventions and innovations and sort of infusing them into our education policy, I would strongly appeal that we go back to the basics and ask such questions as, how many of our schools and communities have electricity? Then number one. Number two, how many of our schools and communities have access to internet? The last time I checked, in Africa, only 22% of the population has access to efficient internet. So when you're talking about AI and you're talking about all these nice things that we need to put in our education curriculum, what does that mean when only 22% of our population has access to internet? Right. So my plea is, it's very good to aim at those very big ideas, but let us make sure that we continue to remember that access to education is for all, right? And when we are discussing education, we understand that it's a human right that belongs to all. And therefore, even those 80% or over 80% of our people on the continent who have no access to electricity and they have no access to internet, they also deserve access to education. And we need to speak up for them. We need to go back to those communities and ensure that they have electricity, they have internet. And then we can start talking about how do we all move together into the fourth industrial revolution. I think the rest of the bullets that are there, I don't need to speak about them. Please look out for the policy brief. It will be on the African Lee website. My colleagues at D4G will definitely also circulate it. Thank you very much, Mame. Over to you.
Justice, thank you so much. This has been so insightful. Thank you, first of all, for reminding us that education fundamentally is a human right for all, and that we need quality education. It should be available and it should be accessible to all. So I guess the big question is it? Is quality education available and accessible to all? And I'm sure on slide 7, UNESCO figures showed us that it's not accessible for some countries. And I think that's really disturbing. So AU, over to you. You have your job cut out for you. Thank you so much, Justice. And we will continue with this session. We'll hear from Divine now. Divine is with the Africa Education Watch. Divine, you have 10 minutes. Divine has contributed to the delivery of quality education in Ghana through innovative teaching, educational research and advocacy, and policy analysis. So, Divine, if you're ready, we're also ready to hear from you.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks for the opportunity to also share with you what we'll be doing as far as Africa education work is concerned, and our observation as far as education is concerned on the continent. My presentation actually is synthesis of cross-country data to give us an outlook of education on the continent. Having said that, over the years, Africa as a continent has made a significant progress when it comes to improving access to education. Available data with Mexico Institute for Statistics suggests that between 2000 and 2002, completion rate actually increased from 52% to 69%. That's for primary. And if we move to the lower secondary school level, it's increased from 35% to 50%, and upper secondary 23% to 33%. Another remarkable achievement is that most countries have closed the gender gap. The gender gap is about 1 of the countries. Some are doing 0.97%, which is also within the recommended gender parity index. And also, primary completion has also increased the last 20 years. We can actually credit some of this progress to interventions such as the free education that most countries are implementing. In some of the countries, either education is completely free or partly free. If we take about 29% of sub-Saharan African countries are actually having free lower upper secondary school. So if we take the upper and the lower secondary school, about 29% of them are implementing free education. And then when we take the lower secondary rate is about 20%. So something has been done to improve access on the continent. But there are some significant challenges that still remain for us to be able to achieve the SDG 4 on the continent, then also the CISA. For me, the issues are more pertaining to access, learning outcome, curriculum relevance, and then equitable investment. Now, when we take access, for example, we're looking at about 87 million children that are out of school in 2000, reaching, that has increased by 13%. So out of school children from 87 million in 2000 to 98 million in 2020. So the problem now is about the number of children that are out of school, that are not having access to education. In Ghana, for instance, we are having about 1 million children that have never even been to school at all, and about 400,000 that were in school but actually dropped out along the line. And then also the rate for upper secondary school increased by 30%. That's where the out of school number is the more. If you look at the figure or the diagram at the right side, you'll see that when we take the upper secondary school, the middle line, the rate actually increased from 25% to 34% from 2000 to 2020. Lower secondary also increased, but very minimal. And that of primary level, the out of school data reduced to by 3 percentage points. Now, if you want to look at regional levels or sub-regional levels on the continent, the out of school rate is more prevalent in Central Africa Republic, where you can have more than half of students or children of school going age being out of school. For example, Equatorial Guinea, we have seen about 55% of the school age going population being out of school. All right. Also, if we want to look at primary school completion rate, 33% of primary school children did not complete primary school. So they may have, mostly the average year of primary school is 6 years. So most of them were unable to complete along the line. They may have started, but along the line, they may have fallen out of the way, which is affecting universal access to education or completion. All right. One other issue when it comes to access is about equity, whether it's rural urban equity or the wealth gap. That's a major issue. Africa is still struggling to close the gap between urban and rural children as far as their access to education is concerned. And also when it comes to wealth quantile, those in the upper wealth quantile have more opportunity to complete school compared to those that are in the lower quantile. So we've still not done enough to improve equity in access to education. Some of the factors, particularly we're talking about inequitable distribution of school buildings. Yes, we may be seeing school building construction, but they are not equitably distributed to go to where actually these buildings will be needed, to ensure that students are able to commute to school within the recommended distance to school. So especially in the rural parts of the country, some still have to commute very long distances to have access to school, especially if it's transitioning from primary to lower secondary school. So some of them do not have lower secondary school attached to their primary school, which ideally should have been the norm, so that transition would have been easy for them. Some of them don't have that, so you even have to actually walk more than the recommended distance to get access to lower secondary school. There are also hidden costs, although a lot of the African countries are implementing free primary education. Some of the hidden costs, such as for your rural ward, some heads of institutions, you still have to ask that they pay for registration, and then examination costs, remuneration for teachers. Some of these hidden costs are actually challenges to parents, and so it's actually refraining them from enrolling their wards. Once they are enrolled and some of these hidden costs are coming and are becoming a challenge to them, they either decide to hold their awards or along the line they divorce. And that school-based violence, one of the challenges that is causing the out-of-school rate to be very high. We're talking about at least 10% of school students would have been experiencing violence in school in the last 3 months. So in Africa. So once school environment is not welcoming the student, what it means is that some of them will prefer to be at home than going to school. And we haven't done enough to address issues of school-based violence. Yes, our attention has been more on gender-based violence in school, but school violence actually goes beyond just the gender-based violence to encompass issues such as psychological abuses, physical abuses as well. All right, the increasing population on the continent is also a threat. To 2030. What it means is that the more the population is growing, the more resources we need to expand access to education. And the reality is that the resources are not there for us to be meeting the population. So the population group is actually a threat. And then the next thing is the conflicts on the continent that is causing schools to be closing along the way. Once schools are closed and children are home for a very long time, even if school finally are reopened, some of the children may not return to school. And a bit of statistics in the 2022 to 2023 academic year, over 2,001 schools were closed due to security issues in the Sahel and Central Africa. That has actually affected about 750,000 children. And as I mentioned, even school is finally reopened, some of these students will not return to school, which means that they'll be out of school or may have dropped out. Quickly to the next issue, which is the learning outcome. That's where we are falling short the most. Since the inception of the SDG, the learning outcome have become the main issue. We are trying to address it. It has even formed the central theme for most African discussions when it comes to education, even more than access now, because during the development, our focus was more on the access. So SDG, our focus are now suited to the quality aspect to ensure that our children are in school and are learning. But sadly, while we may have gotten a number of students to school or children to school, the reality is that they are in school, but they are not learning. And once the child is in school, it means that the school is not being impactful to that student. In 2022, out of the 42 countries that assessment data are available that we look at, 19 countries have less than 20% of their children or of their school going children reaching the end of primary school, achieving minimum proficiency in reading. So only 20% of children will be achieving proficiency in reading. And when it comes to literacy or mathematics, where the rate would have been about 80%. On the average, when we look at what we call learning adjusted year for schooling, that is the child being in school. If the child is expected to be in school for 8 years, if we want to compute the learning outcome, will it be equivalent to the 8 years of being in school? That is the learning adjusted year. So in Ghana, we have about 11.8 years of basic education. So if you want to look at it, that at the end of the 11.8 years, what the child has actually learned, would the learning be equivalent to that number of years? That is the learning adjusted years. So of the 11 points, in Africa also the average year of basic education is 11.9 years. So of the 11.9 years that most of the African children are spent in basic education, the learning equivalence will be 4.5 years. That will be 4.5 years, meaning that they are not even gotten half of learning in their school, right? And if we want to look at it at percentage-wide to be able to look at the various countries, we'll realize that 14% of the African countries, by the end of their basic education year for their primary school children, the learning equivalent would be 2.8 years. 67% of African countries at the end of basic education, learning would have just be about 5.1 years in school, and 60% of the African countries should be having just about 6.5 learning compared to the number of years that we have been. And 2% of the country, the learning equivalence of them spending about 11.9 years in school at 8.5 years. So largely, students are in school but not learning. Another thing to look at is the role of learning poverty. Learning poverty actually looks at age 10 children, their ability to either read or understand a simple text that they're not reading. Once children have reached that stage, their assess, can they read and understand? If they are unable to read, they are classified as being learning poor or achieving learning poverty. And the data suggests that from 2015 to 2019, the learning poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa has increased from 87% to 89%. What it means is that the 87% means the age 10 school children on the continent, 87% of them are not attaining the basic requirements when it comes to reading and understanding. While the global rate in 2015 was 53%, the Sub-Saharan Africa rate was 87%. By simulation, the number is expected to have increased to 89% on the continent. Actually, Central and Western Africa, they house a very large number of students that are learning poor. And if you look at the simulation data about the learning poverty by 2030 for Central and Western Africa, by 2030, we are expecting that would be the end of the SDG. The learning poverty would have just reduced to 74% from 80% in 2019. So the simulations suggest by 2030, about 74% of age 10 children that are on the continent that are in school may not be able to read and understand anything that they have read. So there's causing the learning poverty or the learning crisis in our school, include the irregular learning assessments. We have a system where the focus is much more on teaching and learning than assessing and using the assessment data to provide intervention for the students. So we do not have clear policy on regular learning assessment use of these schools on the continent. While teachers may have doing what they call assessment for learning, while they are teaching, they may be asking questions just to get the student understand. There is no national standard test that regularly assess a student like what Ghana and then Eritrea and then Senegal may be having, to ensure that they have a nationwide standardized examination system that will be producing and then the data will be using to provide intervention. Only 32% of African countries have an established policy to be able to assess for the outcome. We also have been inadequate teachers to be able to achieve universal learning by 2020 last year. We needed about 17 million teachers. By 2030, which is the end of the SDG 4, we need about 17 million teachers. But the current production rates, we may not be able to get that number to be able to ensure that every learner is having a teacher in the classroom. Also, inadequate teaching and learning resources, as mentioned by other speakers. Next issue to talk about is the curriculum relevance. A lot of African countries are actually reviewing or reforming their curriculum to ensure that it addresses issues of 21st century teaching and learning. And from 2015 to date, we can count about 11 countries that have actually done so, giving them a different. But the challenge about this curriculum reform that we have identified that there's this temptation still to make the curriculum too much ambitious. They still want to add a lot of stuff so that the child is in grade one. That child is forced to learn several things. In curriculum development, there should be a priority. As my country, Ghana, is doing, our recent curriculum review actually looks at the issue of depth that we call breadth. What it means that you pick a topic, they treat it in a bit, the child moves to the next grade, it's the same topic, and then build on it and like that. Instead of loading one content and then the child treats it at grade one, leaves it, go to grade two, meets another new topic altogether. No. So there's this temptation to repeat the old mistake of loading content instead of gradually building on is still being repeated in most of the African countries as they are reforming their curriculum. This also temptation to focus on contemporary themes about foundational learning because there are new emerging themes that like citizenship education. Most countries want to focus their curriculum are try to focus on most of these emerging things like AI and stuff compared to the foundational learning skill, which is still a challenge on the country, on the continent. So I think we still need the foundational learning skill. The attention we still want to be on that while we actually blend that with the contemporary issue. There's also this temptation to overlook issue of psychosocial well-being of students in the school. And then the last temptation is the curriculum the temptation to think that once we have reformed the curriculum itself will transform teaching and learning in school. No. So instead of them to deliver the whole package by reforming how teachers are trained, giving support, reforming supervision, once curriculum are developed, the temptation to live with it is also very high. And quickly, the last issue to treat on is the education financing on the continent. I must say, if you look at the 2021 African Union Economic Output Report, suggests that Africa actually is the second highest among the regions when it comes to investments in education. We invest about 5% of our GDP in education. We are the second after the Latin American and Caribbean that are doing 5.2%. And then also, when you look at the overall budget credibility, the average is about 95%, meaning what governments allocate in the budget and versus what they actually release at the end of the fiscal year. The average percentage is 95%, which is a plus, is a good credit, a plus. But while we may be spending on education more, we are not efficient in the utilization. The report indicates that about 42% of our education spending at the primary school level actually goes with, and then 59% at the secondary school level also actually goes with because of the number of issues. If we are able to improve spending efficiency in our educational system, we'll be able to achieve universal school enrollment just by, without even necessarily increasing spending on education, just by promoting spending efficiency within the education system. So finally, as CSO, what can we do? I think we have to promote evidence use in policy formulation. Most often, policies are formulated by government without recourse to evidence. So there's a need for CSOs to engage much more using policy to engage policymakers or data to engage policymakers in order to come out with policy that actually goes to align with the issues. CSO will also have to on government and public awareness in education on the continent, hold national governments accountable to international education commitments. Countries are a lot of international commitments as far as education is concerned. When it comes to education spending, countries are supposed to at the levels of about 4% to 6% of GDP or 15 to 20% of national budget. So we need to hold them accountable to some of these international commitments. Then also empower citizens and citizens to demand accountability. CSO alone cannot do it. We are able to empower citizens at the grassroots level to demand accountability on educational outcome, how teaching and learning is going in their area, why students are performing poorly. The citizen group or the students themselves are demanding accountability right from the local level. Then the local authority will begin to act, not just necessarily demanding the accountability from the top, which is the national government level. There was a need for CSOs to promote peering among themselves, learn from each other what best practices they are using in their countries to ensure they advocate for quality education. And then lastly, there must be a mechanism for CSO to monitor education spending. While spending may be increasing at the national level, but there are countries that still have less spending in education. So at the national level, CSO will have to monitor education spending and demand accountability. Thank you for attention.
Divine, thank you so much for that. You've taken some of our time, but I can understand there's so much to unpack from your presentation. Thank you. I mean, you're telling us 98 million of school children are out of school. That's very staggering. And the reading proficiency rates of kids in Africa, only 20% out of 42 countries sampled. That's also very disturbing. But because of time, we'll go straight into our next session. We're going to be hearing from our CSOs who have been working in the education sector to give us, from their perspective, some of the challenges they've encountered in the education sector. And we will quickly go there into it. We'll call on Mbabato Mongai to give us her perspective from the Southern African region. Mbabato, if you're ready, please speak to us, but please note that we only have 5 minutes, so let's hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So just in wrapping up and keeping the main thing, I think that, and in linking it with what everybody has said, that number one, I mean, there is no argument against the fact that education is a human right. However, as a continent, we need to move past trying to focusing on numbers, but equally focusing on the quality of education. Now, something that I come from, we represent Good Governance Africa, and our main objective is to promote and enhance governance by somewhat closing the gap between the private sector, citizens, and the government. And this is mainly done through research, which includes data-driven research. Now, with the work that we've done, we have identified and established that no issue or challenge, and in this particular case, education ever exists in isolation. So for one of the programs that we did was and we kind of gave them the platform to educate us and to inform us what are the challenges that they are faced with in as far as education is concerned. Now, that was, I suppose, a very prime and practical example of the need to decentralize education. Now, one of the critiques that we as Africans often give international organizations and initiatives is that they impose certain policies and initiatives. I think that we should, as CSOs, we should also be mindful of not doing the same thing, opposed to assuming that, okay, education is a problem, how do we fix the schools? How about we actually also equally focus on going to the communities, engaging with the people and asking them, what are your challenges that are faced? I know that education is one of the primary ones, but alongside that, what are some of the bottlenecks that prevent either access to education or completion? Now, with this particular workshop that we had, we identified that, yes, education, access to it is not only a challenge, but other factors, and Justice mentioned some of these points, which include things such as transportation, sanitation, food, are some of the challenges that many, if millions of students are faced with. So you can have access to education, but if that is not accompanied a speed bump to the quality of education, it puts a speed bump into other factors such as, I don't want to say the haves and have-nots, but we can all be in the same space, but have different experiences and therefore benefit from the particular resource, in this particular case, education, differently. Now, in creating this link between the private sector, government, and ordinary citizens, and what I had mentioned of, and the primary objective there being to decentralize education and access to education. One important thing there is that, number one, it demystifies this approach that is sometimes consciously and subconsciously adopted of a student/teacher take when it comes to addressing certain challenges. But one important thing, and I think that many see, is always, we also need to be cognizant of, is that we are not government, nor are we trying to replace government, nor are we anti-government. Our central role is to improve, to keep government to account, not just government, but also private sectors. And we are essentially, or see ourselves as the voice to the, I don't even want to say voiceless, because it insinuates that we don't have a sense of agency. So what I would rather say, to amplify and to empower the voices of those that do not have the spaces that we do. So in trying to once again keep up with the 5 minutes that you gave me, one other key point that I would like to point out, and once again this ties in with what Justice said, is that we also need to be cognizant of establishing, and this actually ties in with the first point I made, context-specific responses. So things such as technology, like, there are conversations around 4IR, the need to incorporate technology and so forth. But how do we do that, and how do we prioritize that when there's a digital gap within, Africa, when many households do not have access to electricity, when many households do not have access to water or sanitation? How do you then say to millions of those individuals that we are now revolutionizing education? That will fall into the trap of widening the education gap. And as you all know, education is currency. Fortunately or unfortunately, education determines or highly influences your quality of life. So my main point, if there's anything to take from what I've said, is that improving and enhancing education should never be done in isolation. We need to look at the specific challenges observations, but engaging with those very same citizens and including them in the decision-making process. If we are advocating for building a particular school in a rural or urban community, we should never include citizens at the end product, but allow them to be part of the inception and the conceptualization of the initiative that we have. And that's me.
Betha, that's so awesome. I feel like we should have given you more time because you have so much to share, and the point about involving the community right from the beginning is very, very critical. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I'm happy to call on Lydia Kembambazi. Lydia will be sharing her perspective also from the West Africa region. Lydia, are you ready?
Thank you so much, ma'am. My name is Lydia Kembabazi. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I also work at the IHRDA as the advocacy officer. I'm grateful to all the discussions, insightful and enlightening, and we can all agree that actually education is a human right. The data here today exposes stark and reveals realities and disparities, challenges that we have faced as we try to accelerate the achievement of SGDV4, and the Continental Strategy for Education in Africa. From our perspective as HRDA, our mandate really is to promote and protect human rights and development in Africa. And so we definitely look at education as a human rights and it's a priority. And currently the challenges that we face, referencing general comments from the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. They are concluding observations as well on state reports, as well as statistics from UNICEF, UNESCO. These challenges vary across countries and regions within West Africa, but mainly accessibility to education is a challenge. We currently have a case that I will not comment on, but the River Ofin case in the Ashanti region of the Republic of Ghana, where girls can't go to school when they are on their period. They can't cross the river if you're a girl because the river god at times is out on particular days, but also have to use paddle boats to go across rivers to attend school. And UNICEF has actually given us statistics onto the next one on the issue of quality of education, which I believe, of course, this varies on context, but 9 out of 10 children in sub-Saharan Africa cannot read and understand a simple text by the age of 10, which is very worrying if we are to ensure that we actually live up to the African Union theme for this year. Still on the issue of gender disparities in education persists in many parts of West Africa, with girls facing barriers to access education, but also complete education. In Liberia, the enrollment rate is at 33% for girls compared to boys who are at 98% for primary level education. However, also cultural issues and norms also affect and impact education in West Africa. We were recently in Sierra Leone last week on a case that we litigated upon waves and child society welfare of Sierra Leone against Sierra Leone for banning pregnant girls from attending school. The social stigma that comes with that there was actually a ban for pregnant girls attending school. Then you look at Benin, where some Quranic schools encourage Talib children to beg as a form of child labor and not stay in school, as a social setting where they are not expected to be in school, but are seen as people who can engage in child labor. Furthermore, political instability and conflict, when you look at the situation of northern Nigeria, disrupts education system, and ensuring safety and security of students and staff definitely can be a significant challenge in such contexts. However, also technology infrastructure, where many children lack basic infrastructure, electricity, buildings, and functioning classrooms. These have been in all general comments and concluding observation on most of the state reports by the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. However, also what is key, I've noted, is the cost of education. Most education is meant to be free and compulsory, at least for many states and countries, up to 16 years. However, there are other hidden costs, extra classes that are needed, Parents Teachers Association, fees that hinder provision of this service. Case of Ghana, of course, there is also residual payments and precondition for enrollment of school and retention. And that is usually to be common coming up in state reports for Senegal, for Nigeria. In Mauritania, there's been a lot of lack of qualified teachers in general, but also when we look at education being an all-inclusive right for everybody, disabled girls, pregnant ones, teen moms, everybody being in school, with Mauritania lacks a lot of special needs education and adequate facilities to cater for such situations and conditions that might come with the people who want to attend school. On that note, I also would like to mention that the issue that we are dealing with, of course, now is how do we ensure quality for all, education for all. State parties, I believe, could ensure within context, absolutely. There are those states where there's infrastructure, but there are no teachers. There are those that might have the teachers, but do not have infrastructure. So I believe every context should be, every state, every government, every country should be taken into context and prioritize what is needed to ensure that public and private institutions provide inclusive and quality education of a comparable standard. I believe that states also might need to invest in improving infrastructure and providing access to technology to enhance educational opportunities. For example, there's a national policy on girls' education in Liberia that could benefit and could be a comparative study that accommodates on how to manage gender disparities when it comes to education, but also after the case of Sierra Leone banning pregnant girls and that it was revoked, there was a policy called radical inclusion, where all girls are encouraged to stay in school, whether they are disabled, whether they are poor, whether they are pregnant, or whether they are teen moms, which I believe can be picked and can be used comparatively depending on context to apply to support peer-to-peer learning on how to ensure that we actually achieve the AU theme. And adopting, of course, the continental strategy for education in Africa could go a long way in implementing targeted interventions to address these disparities. The strategy calls for a paradigm shift towards transformative education and the training systems to meet the knowledge, competence, skills, contexts, research, innovation, and creativity required to nurture African core values and promote sustainable development. For HRDA, that is our perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was really insightful. And last but not the least, I'd like to call on Itsimo Namwaya, sorry, to give us his perspective from East Africa.
Allow me to appreciate the speakers who have gone ahead of me for the very rich presentations.
Could you please give me 1 second? Please, if you are not talking, kindly mute your microphone. We hear some noise in the background. Okay, please continue.
I was saying that allow me to appreciate the speakers who have gone ahead of me for the very rich presentations. I work for Human Rights Watch. I'm not necessarily giving a perspective from East Africa. I'm giving a take on from the human rights perspective. I was supposed to come in as a panelist. Just looking at some of the issues that have come up during the discussions. And my key takeaways from a human rights perspective is the issue of the right to education, which I think Justice discussed quite ably. But at Human Rights Watch, together with other human rights groups on the continent, we have been pushing for that right to be expanded to not just be right to education, but to push for something like the right to free education, which would include right to pre-primary education, primary education and secondary education. We have seen that countries that have taken some basic steps to, like Sierra Leone, which has a right to free pre-primary education. The numbers of those who have been able to access education has jumped tremendously. I think for Sierra Leone is something like 23% to 81%, which is significant. And if that can be applied across the levels of education all the way to secondary education, I think the right to access education could be really addressed. Then the other issue that I wanted to mention, which has also come up during the other presentations, is the issue of the right to safe schools, I'm just going through them quickly because I could talk about some of these issues for long, but I think I was informed I just have about 5 minutes. So the the right to free schools is an issue we have been talking to various stakeholders, including the AU, I think, the UN as well, and various governments on the continent, especially in the context of some of the conflicts on the continent. We have situations where armed groups have set up camp inside schools, or situations where schools have been attacked, or situations where even in peaceful situations, where during protests, security forces have thrown tear gas inside schools or shot level munitions inside schools. All these issues, together with those that others have raised, go into the right to safe schools or safe school environment. And then the third issue that I wanted to just highlight is the issue of affordability, which has also come up. I think data has been shared about how just making schools affordable can help reduce the numbers of those who are out of schools. And the data on the people who are out of school because of inability to afford school is actually very huge. And we have been talking to governments across the continent and maybe beyond on how to enhance affordability of education. The other issue is, which also actually goes hand in hand with the issue of affordability, is the question of the responsibility of governments to invest in schools or in education. And that also touches on affordability, economic access, that is, and physical access, which I think Justice talked about quite ably. And there have been some positive improvements in some of the governments we have been talking to, but it's still a big challenge across the continent, an issue that I think all stakeholders need to pay attention to and probably try to push for better investment. And then last but not least, without belaboring the point, is the issue of non-discrimination, which cuts across many levels. But on the basis of that, I just wanted to highlight the issue of teenage pregnancies in various African countries, including Tanzania, where the teenagers who become pregnant are forced out of school and do not get a chance to be able to finish their school at all. And we have been trying to push for this. I think there have been some improvements. Particularly Tanzania has started accepting that perhaps this is a wrong practice, but across the continent, this is going on. And I think together with other stakeholders, it's an issue that we hope we can push for governments to begin to allow those who become pregnant midway to be able to go back to finish their education. With that, allow me to just conclude those short remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these important points with us. Safe school, affordability, non-discrimination, especially with regards to teenage pregnancies. Thank you so much. So we have some few minutes left. We are now moving into our Q&A session, but because we're already 2 hours in, unfortunately, we can't spend a lot of time on that. But we've had some interesting comments from our participants. Thank you so much for staying with us up to this point. I'll just read a few. So, for instance, Resti Dabagala wrote this to us. She said, CSO is a force to reckon in promoting education in Africa. Many of the policy and decision makers in African states know nothing about the education crisis in African schools because their children study from abroad. Truly, transforming education in Africa requires a holistic approach and pushing for strong political will. Thank you so much, Resti, for sending that in. We also had Dinah Achola. She said, the call to go back to the basics is very important. when we talk about going digital, yet a large percentage of our communities are not connected on the national electricity grid and cannot afford solar, then we surely need to go back to the basics of looking at how prepared we are to advance these transformations. And she's thanking Justice for bringing these issues up. We also have one from Jacqueline. I'm reading the last one from Jacqueline, where she says, how can we restore confidence in our education systems, both formal and informal? Informal education is not highly valued, even though it has great potential in job creation, especially the TVET institutions. And Jacqueline, I remember Gumi, and I think Ambassador also spoke to this, looking at other forms of education, looking at technical, like you've mentioned, and vocational, and making reforming the national policies when it comes to conversation on education. So thank you so much, our participants, for sending this comment. For the others that we're not able to answer or speak to, we'll surely touch on it on our social media platforms, particularly on Twitter, for now X, and then on LinkedIn as well. So at this point, we're just wrapping up. I'd love to call on Douglas once again to give us updates on our convenings and then closing remarks. Douglas, please take over.
Thank you so much, our able moderator. I think you've done very well in ensuring that we are well managed, and also for the presenters. And I think we've done an amazing job. On convenings, I think just want to mention a few things that as Data for Governance Alliance, we use the annual convenings as our main platform. Just come in and sensitize our civil society organizations, and now more than ever before, we are trying to bring other members of the community, because we also noted that our civil society organizations also do not work in silos. They work within the context of the private sector. They work also in the context of the government. They also work in the context of other people that also support their work. So we use this platform to just sensitize them on key thematic areas that are of interest to us. And you can be sure that this year, the African Union's Agenda 2063, especially on the theme education, will be our main focus, and other issues around the continent. We have so many prevalent issues. There's the issues of elections, education now comes in here, adherence to the rule of law, all these issues. We just use our convenings as a platform to just look at what data by Afrobarometer is saying. Like you have seen that our Safika has really taken time to just take us through data, and I'm sure that will be shared with our participants so that they can be able to digest at their own individual platforms. So that's what we are going to do that. So this year, be on the lookout as you continue to support our work. Once we have tentatively settled on the dates of our convenings, we are going to share them, but it should be around the second quarter, God willing. Then we can be able to bring you on board, both in South Africa, West Africa, and East Africa. And I'm so happy that also in absentia, our coordinator from West Africa, Paul, sends his regards, Paul Mensa. And I think we might also give, I don't know whether our coordinator for South Africa is here, Nyasha. He can say just a hi to our members, that he has also been very vocal and also helping to put up this webinar today. So I don't know whether through the chair, Mame, I don't know whether Nyasha is there. He can say something.
Douglas, I think that you're speaking on behalf of your other coordinators, because
okay.
far pressed with time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you so much. And I think as I conclude, I think we have all agreed that education is going to be a very key theme this year. So my challenge to our civil society organizations and participants here, if you can look at ways in which you can also contribute to the conversations, looking at the data, what the data is saying, creating papers and policy briefs around these areas. I think it also gives you so many opportunities going forward with our AU organs. If they have events where maybe you can come and share your findings, I think in that interest, I really challenge you to be a bit inquisitive in that arena, so that we can give you opportunities to be able to share your findings, like what our Divine has done. He has a lot of quality data. So we really thank you, and also to thank the African Union for allowing us to just get that opportunity to be able to share and talk about the theme, and also Ambassador Sarah even facing this occasion. So we are more than delighted, and we look forward to working with you more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Douglas. And on that note, first to say that I am so happy that the D4G team in Afrobarometer entrusted me to guide this conversation. It's been an honor. Thank you so much. But also, most importantly, thank you to all our speakers for spending time with us, for preparing for this webinar, and for sharing all these wonderful insights with us. So much to unpack. From Brenda, who told us that we need to have policies that go beyond political cycles, to Gumi, who's introduced the MAD to us, Make Africa Digital, to Ambassador, who told us that we need to reform education policies at a national level. Justice, reminding us that education is a human right, and Divine giving us those worrying numbers about how many children are out of school and the learning poverty rate, and also to our CSOs who have shared with us all the important work they are doing, in making the conversation on education very relevant. Thank you so much. And last but not the least, thank you to our participants who've been with us from the beginning to this point for all the great insights you put in our chat box. We see it, and we promise you we'll engage with you out of this webinar. We will be with you on social media. So please follow our pages and watch out for our comments. We are on X, formerly Twitter, and then you also find us on LinkedIn as well. And on that note, thank you, everybody. It's goodbye for now.